Hey everyone, it's Mostly Casual Commander. I'm BK. We're on Discord, Instagram, and Patreon. Links in the description. We lined up another game with Lord of the Rings commanders. First up is J-Man with Shelob. This is Spider Tribal looking to make food token copies of his opponent's stuff. Next we have Busterkins with Tom Bombadil, basically Saga Tribal, looking to churn through his deck and get all the sagas out in play. I brought my Aragorn the Uniter deck back out. I'm looking to cast multicolored spells to take advantage of Aragorn's abilities and go to Value Town. Kovacs is playing Saruman of many colors. He's on the mill plan, and he wants to double spell on turns so that he can cast free stuff from his opponent's graveyard. Please subscribe to help us grow, follow us on Instagram, and of course stick around for an appearance from my fat cat Meatball. He's so chunky. J-Man started us off by playing Undergrowth Stadium, passing to Busterkins, who plays a tapped Sacred Foundry. Over to me, I play Ketria Triome as my land for turn, and pass over to Kovacs, who plays an island, and he casts, you guessed it, a turn 1 Soul Ring. There's always one, right? Just always. He passes back over to J-Man, who plays a Swamp, as his land for turn into a Canopy Spider. This thing's a 1/3 with reach. Watch out! He passes back over to Busterkins, who draws and plays a Godless Shrine, having it enter the battlefield untapped at the cost of 2 points of life. He casts Scholar of New Horizons. This thing enters the battlefield with a 1/1 counter on it, and can mess with counters on his board. I drop a Hinterland Harbor as my land for turn, and I have to say go back over to Kovacs. He plays a Fancy Island as his land, and casts Commander Sphere, getting even more ramp. What's he gonna do with all that mana? On J-Man's turn, he plays another Swamp, and casts Cultivate. This will have him go into his library and find a forest, entering the battlefield tapped, and a forest goes into his hand as well. He passes over to Busterkins, who plays a Verdant Catacombs. He immediately sacks that, taking 1 point of life, and goes and finds a Breeding Pool, having that bad boy enter the battlefield untapped for 2 points of life as well. Then he casts Satyr Enchanter, so he's looking to draw a whole bunch of cards whenever he casts his sagas. Busterkins moves into combat at Kovacs. He just takes 2 to his face, and then Busterkins passes to me. I play Rootbound Crag as my land for turn, and cast Rhythm of the Wild. So my creatures can't be countered, and they have Riot, so they can either get thick or fast. I pass, and on Kovacs' turn, he plays Marsh Flats, then he immediately cracks that, losing 1 point of life. Then he'll go into his library and fetch up a Prairie Stream. That'll enter the battlefield untapped, and he'll cast his commander, Saruman of Many Colors. With that out on the battlefield, he passes the turn back over to J-Man. He draws and plays a forest as his land for turn before casting Mazarek, Crawl Death Priest. And it's not a spider, but it can make his spiders super thick and super swole. He passes, and Busterkins plays Ziator's Proving Ground as his land for turn before casting Sterling Grove. On the stack, it triggers Satyr Enchanter, so he'll draw a card, and then he'll move into combat, swinging at me because he can. I drop to 36, and he passes. On my turn, I play a Mountain as my land, and I have to say go back over to Kovacs. But he says draw go over to J-Man, who plays an Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, as his land. So then he has enough to cast his commander, Shelob, Child of Ungoliant. That was pronounced right? He hops into the red zone, swinging at Busterkins and Kovacs, who both take their beats before he passes. On Busterkins' turn, he plays Elish Norn, so now his opponents have to think twice before attacking into him. He moves into combat again at me, because it's the best way for him to deal damage. On my turn, I draw and play a Plains, which I desperately needed, in order to cast Eowyn Fearless Knight. She gets a counter off of Rhythm, and then I target Saruman with her triggered ability, discarding Dovin's Veto to pay his ward cost. In response, Kovacs casts Consider into a Void Rend, targeting Eowyn as payback. Void Rend triggered Kovacs' commander, so each of his opponents mills 2 cards, and then Kovacs can cast a copy of an instant, sorcery, or enchantment of 3 mana value or less. He found a Cultivate from J-Man's graveyard, so he'll go find 2 lands, an island onto his battlefield, and a swamp to his hand. Then Eowyn and Saruman both die. Yay! With nothing left to do, I pass over to Kovacs, who plays a Swamp as his land for turn, and then casts Sphere of Safety. So with that out, he might deter some of his opponent's attacks. He passes, and on J-Man's turn, he plays a Swamp, and then he casts Twin Silk Spider. That enters the battlefield with its brother or sister, another 1/2 with reach. Then he moves into combat, swinging at Busterkins and Kovacs, taking them down a notch, and dealing a bunch of commander damage to Kovacs. He passes the turn over to Busterkins, who plays a Misty Rainforest Swamp, cause Urborg says it's a swamp. He then casts his commander, Tom Bombadil. All he's missing now are a bunch of sagas. And then he moves into combat with Elish Norn and his Scholar, dealing me damage, dropping me to 27. On my turn, I play Galadriel, Gift Giver. When that enters the battlefield, I throw a +1/+1 counter onto her because of Rhythm of the Wild. And I also make a treasure token, not at all thinking of J-Man's Mazarek. I pass a turn, and Kovacs plays a Chromatic Lantern, giving him more ramp and turn his lands into better lands. On J-Man's turn, he plays a Swamp as his land, and then casts Grave Shifter. so that's a spider. And when it ETBs, he can go into his graveyard and find something to put into his hand. He found a Finn the Fangbearer, but immediately cast that afterwards. Realizing how bad that could be, Kovacs saves us by casting Syncopate, where X equals one more than J-Man can afford. That'll exile Finn the Fangbearer, and J-Man decides to take his revenge on Kovacs, paying 1 in order to attack with Shelob, dropping him down to 19. Over to Busterkins, he played a Mountain, and played Verduran Enchantress, so another thing that draws him cards whenever he plays enchantments. Then he casts not an enchantment, but an Arcane Signet. He passes, and on my turn I play an Arid Swamp Mesa. Black mana is not really going to help me in my deck, but I don't want to sack it because of J-Man's Mazarek. I cast my commander, Aragorn the Uniter, and when that ETBs, I give it a +1 counter, thanks to Rhythm of the Wild, and move into combat with Galadriel at Kovacs paying 1. When Galadriel attacked, I made another treasure, and Kovacs takes some damage. On his turn, he casts Baral, Chief of Compliance. He passes, J-Man draws and says, I'm gonna go to combat, but before he can, Kovacs casts Dress Down. This will turn all creatures into vanilla nothing burgers. Therefore, J-Man forgoes attacking and moves into his second main phase, casting Universal Automaton. That's a spider. He passes, and on his end step, Dress Down goes away. On Busterkin's turn, he plays Elspeth Conquers Death. This triggers Satyr Enchanter and Verduran Enchantress. In response to those triggered abilities, Kovacs casts Notion Thief, scooping up Busterkin's card draws. Busterkin's Sadness hits the stack, but despite that, he still tries to help the whole table out by exiling Shelob with Elspeth Conquers Death. He pays the ward cost. In response, Cosmic Hunger is cast by J-Man, so he'll have Shelob fight Elishnorn. And because Shelob will kill Elishnorn dead, Elishnorn dies, but it becomes a food token on J-Man's side of the board. Shelob goes away, thank goodness, and Busterkins attacks with Tom Bombadil at J-Man. He just takes the 4 damage, and Busterkins pay the 2 life because of Elishnorn. On my turn, I cast Gandalf the Grey. When he hits the stack, he triggers my commander, so I get to scry 2, as well as deal 3 points of damage to an opponent's face. I put the scryed cards to the bottom, and J-Man drops to 31. Gandalf resolves, and Rhythm of the Wild says, Yo, riot! I move into combat, swinging my eligible attackers at J-Man. Galadriel says, get a +1 counter, Aragorn. J-Man decides to take all of it to his face, and I pay 1 for Elishnorn as well as 2 life. As a follow-up, I play Sacred Foundry, having it enter the battlefield untapped. I'm not in a hurry. On Kovacs' turn, he plays an island, and then casts Heliod, the Radiant Dawn. When that ETBs, he returns Dress Down to his hand. Afterwards, and with the help of paying 2 life for the Phyrexian mana, he decides to transform Heliod into Heliod the Warped Eclipse. So now all of his things have flash, and stuff costs less to cast when people draw cards. On J-Man's turn, he played a Swamp, and that gave him enough manas to recast his commander, Shelob. So once again, his spider army has Ward and Death Touch. He goes attacking into Busterkins, who decides to just take it all to his face as opposed to giving some chump blocks, and food copy tokens to J-Man. On his end step, Busterkins activates his Scholar of New Horizons, removing the lore counter from Elspeth Who Conquers Death, getting a Plains card out onto his battlefield. Then, after he draws, he puts a lore counter back on his saga, and targets Shelob once again, paying for the ward cost. He's doing good stuff keeping Shelob away. He plays a Karn's Bastion as his land, and then follows that up by casting Jin Gataxius. He's hoping for even more card draw when he casts his sagas. He moves into combat at J-Man once again, with his 4/4 commander. J-Man takes it, Busterkins says pass, and on my turn I play Prince Imrahil the Fair. When I cast it, it triggers Aragorn, getting me a 1/1 as well as a scry 2. And I decide to put both of those cards onto the bottom of my library. Rhythm of the Wild is triggered when Imrahil enters the battlefield, getting a +1/+1 counter. Moving to combat at Busterkins as well as Kovacs, paying the 2 because of Sphere of Safety. On the attack, Galadriel puts a +1 counter on Gandalf, and Kovacs decides to flash in a Thought Vessel before declaring blocks with the thing that gives his stuff flash. Just in case I could pump Galadriel, I suspect. Busterkins blocks with his Verduran Enchantress and takes the rest over the top. I forget how big Heliod was, so he just gobbles up Galadriel. I pass the turn, and Kovacs plays Cut Your Losses with Casualty 2, therefore copying the spell and sacrificing his Notion Thief in order to do so. This will trigger Mazarek on J-Man's board, giving +1/+1 counters on each of his creatures. Kovacs targeted Busterkins with Cut Your Losses, so Busterkins has to mill half of his library twice. Following that, he casts Fractured Sanity, having each one of his opponents mill 14 cards. This brings Busterkin's library count down to 9. It's a very comfortable library count. Very comfortable. Kovacs then passes the turn over to J-Man, who plays an Overgrown Tomb as his land for turn, and decides to have it enter the battlefield untapped, taking 2 points of life. Having it untapped meant he could recast his commander, Shelob. J-Man says move to combat, and again, before that happens, Kovacs casts Stress Down. As a result, J-Man again decides not to attack, so he passes the turn. On Busterkin's upkeep, he activates his Scholar of New Horizons, again removing a lore counter off of his saga, draws, and then adds a lore counter back to it, again targeting Shelob, keeping her off the board, paying the ward cost. He then casts the Kami War, triggering Jin-Gitaxias and his Satyr Enchanter. This will draw him 2 more very dangerous cards. He targets my commander with the Kami War and moves into combat at Kovacs, paying the 2, and Kovacs blocks with Heliod, gobbling up his Satyr Enchanter. I see why you did that, Busterkins. On Busterkin's end step, Kovacs cracks his Commander Sphere, drawing a card, but also triggering J-Man's Mazarek again, getting a +1 counter on everything. On my turn, I recast Aragorn the Uniter, cause I need the value, right? Rhythm the Wild gives him haste, and I attack Busterkins with everything. Declares blocks with Jin-Gitaxias, and before damage, I cast Boros Charm, triggering my commander, and having Boros Charm give my creatures indestructible. So Aragorn says, hey J-Man, take a lightning bolt to your face, and I also get a 1/1, so that's neat. In addition, Gandalf the Grey triggers, so each of my opponents take 3 damage. I used treasures to pay for Boros Charm, so that triggered Mazarek twice, sadly. With Boros Charm, as well as all those triggered abilities resolved, we clean up from combat, Jin-Gitaxias dies, and Busterkins drops down to 6. I'm liking my odds, but I'm thinking I probably should have attacked J-Man instead. On Kovacs' turn, he recasts Saruman and had to say go over to J-Man, who casts Sky Fisher Spider. If that resolves, J-Man will get to sack a thing, and then make his army bigger. So in response, Kovacs casts Dark Ritual, as well as Counterspell. And when he casts Counterspell, Saruman triggers, so each of his opponents mills 2 cards, and then Kovacs can cast a free 2-drop instant sorcery or enchantment. And after he reviewed his options in each of his opponent's graveyards, he finds my Boros Charm and has it deal me 4 points of damage to my face, trying to knock me down a peg or 2. He drew off a Baral, the spell got countered, and J-Man moves into combat at myself and Busterkins. He has Mazarek fly over the top of Tom Bombadil at Busterkins, and the rest of his spider army attacking me. Before damage, he cracks his Elish Food, pumping his team, and then has enough damage to knock both him and I out of the game. He follows that up by casting Lignify on Heliod and passing back to Kovacs. He plays a Swamp as his land, and then he drops Blind Obedience. So now J-Man's things enter tapped, and Kovacs can start extorting. Casts Metallurgic Summonings. This will trigger both Blind Obedience as well as Saruman. So he does extort it thanks to Blind Obedience, going to 10 and dropping J-Man to 9. J-Man mills 2, and then Kovacs finds an Extinction Event, castable thanks to Saruman from J-Man's graveyard. Kovacs chooses Odd with Extinction Event, so J-Man will lose about half his army, and Kovacs keeps all of his. He then moves into combat with his commander at J-Man, dropping him to 3. He passes, and the slugfest continues as J-Man goes directly into combat, paying for the Sphere of Safety costs. Decides to chump with his Lignified Heliod and take the rest, dropping down to 5. In his second main phase, J-Man casts Chatterfang Squirrel General, Honorary Spider. It was meant to enter the battlefield tapped. We missed that on accident, but it did not impact the game. Kovacs' turn, he plays Lazav Dimir Mastermind, extorting it on the way in, thanks to Blind Obedience. And at this point, Kovacs is on the defensive with no cards in hand, so he passes. J-Man goes right into the red zone. Due to the size of those spiders, Kovacs is forced to chump block with all 3 of his creatures. Then J-Man passes the turn. Kovacs finds a Plains off the top of his library and says go. On J-Man's turn, he attacks, knocking Kovacs out of the game, making J-Man the winner. Congratulations, buddy. And here's Meatball. He's so chunky. And there you have it, that's the game. What did you guys think about this one featuring Lord of the Rings commanders? Let us know what you thought about the game in the comments. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Follow us on Instagram and Discord. And as always, thank you for watching.